Imagine standing on a porch, fixing up a house, when suddenly screams echo across the street. A woman is shouting at workers in safety vests, waving her arms like the world is ending. Within minutes, the situation escalates. Neighbors gather. Police arrive, and the shocking twist: the woman causing all the chaos is the HOA president herself. What happens next will leave you speechless. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day. I was at an older neighborhood managed by an HOA, working on some repairs to the front porch of a house. The street was calm, the kind of calm you'd expect from a place where people had probably lived for years, raising families and following the usual HOA rules about keeping the grass trimmed and the sidewalks clear. There wasn't anything unusual at first. No drama, no chaos, nothing that would have made you think the day was about to turn into a story worth remembering. I was focused on my work, paying attention to the small details of what I was fixing, when a sound cut through the quiet. First, it was just faint yelling, something sharp enough to make me pause and look up. I thought maybe it was kids fooling around or a couple arguing in their driveway, but the tone was different. It wasn't playful, and it wasn't a normal conversation gone a little too loud. This was something else, raw, emotional, and angry. Curiosity started pulling me in. I set down what I was holding and listened closer. The yelling grew clearer, the voice rising with every word, and it became obvious that this wasn't going to fade away. Across the street, I spotted a middle-aged woman standing in her yard, her body language as loud as her voice. Her arms were flailing, sharp motions slicing through the air. Her whole posture locked into confrontation mode. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide whether to mind my business or check on what was going on. But the thing about human instinct is, when you hear distress in someone's voice, you can't just ignore it. I started walking across the street, and with every step, the scene became clearer. 3 men in bright safety vests stood near the curb, tools in hand, orange cones around them. They weren't shouting back. They weren't even defensive. They looked tired already, like they had been dealing with this for several minutes. Their job was simple. They were installing a new fiber line in the neighborhood, which meant putting in a new demarcation box just a few feet from the existing telephone box. For most communities, that kind of upgrade would be welcome: faster internet, better service, more value to the homes. But not for this woman. Her face was twisted with anger as she shouted at them, pointing furiously at the small patch of ground where they were working. I caught pieces of what she was saying. "This is my yard, and you can't put that here." Her voice was full of ownership and outrage, as if they were digging up her flower bed instead of working on the legal utility easement that ran along the property. The workers, to their credit, stayed calm. They explained, patiently, that they were authorized to put the box where they were. It wasn't up for debate, it was part of the easement, but their words seemed to bounce right off of her. Every explanation was met with louder yelling. Every attempt to calm her only fanned the flames of her anger. I stood off to the side, watching. It was like seeing a fire that had already spread too far to be controlled. The woman wasn't listening, and the men clearly didn't want to escalate the situation. Still, she kept going, her voice carrying so far that doors began opening down the block. Neighbors peeked out, drawn by the noise, their faces curious, some of them already holding up phones to record. The whole thing stretched on. Not just a quick burst of anger, but a sustained storm. She wasn't letting go of her outrage. It had already gone on 4 minutes before I even walked over, and it showed no sign of stopping. The men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the street like they were hoping backup would arrive. The woman, on the other hand, seemed to grow stronger with every second, feeding off her own fury, convinced that she could shout her way into control. What struck me most in that moment was the contrast. On one side, 3 professionals trying to finish a job that benefited the entire community. On the other side, one homeowner who decided that the rules didn't apply to her. And right there, caught in the middle of it all, the calm little neighborhood was being forced to witness a showdown that none of them had signed up for. I didn't know it yet, but what I was watching wasn't just an argument about a utility box. It was the start of something much bigger, something that was about to spiral so far out of control. People would be talking about it long after the workers had packed up their tools. The yelling didn't stop. If anything, it grew sharper, more relentless. Like the woman had decided, the louder she screamed, the more power she could create out of thin air. Her whole body moved with her voice, hands slicing the air, fists clenching, pointing aggressively at the men like they had committed some sort of personal crime against her. The 3 workers stood their ground, but you could see the weariness on their faces. These weren't men who were interested in confrontation. They were contractors, probably used to dealing with occasional pushback from homeowners who didn't understand easements. But this was different. This woman wasn't just asking questions or even making a complaint. She was exploding with anger as though the fiber line was a personal attack. One of the workers tried again, his tone professional, almost rehearsed, explaining that the small box they were installing wasn't on her private property, that the easement gave them the legal right to be there. He gestured calmly toward the existing telephone box a few feet away. pointing out that this new piece of equipment was no different. But his words might as well have been spoken in another language. She cut him off with a scream, her voice cracking as she shouted that this was her yard, her land, and she wouldn't tolerate anyone touching it. Her voice carried so far down the street that people to houses over stepped outside to see what was going on. The neighborhood, normally so quiet, was now buzzing with whispers and the faint hum of phone cameras clicking on. What made the scene so uncomfortable was the imbalance. These men were doing their jobs, staying composed, clearly wanting to avoid conflict. Yet here was this woman, acting as if she were in the middle of a war zone, fighting for her life. She wasn't arguing about money or a personal violation. She was fighting against something inevitable, something entirely outside of her control. At one point, she bent down toward the ground, waving her hand just inches from where the men had been working, yelling about how she'd spent years maintaining her yard and how she wouldn't let them ruin it. Her face flushed red, her words tumbling out faster, her body language becoming even more animated. The workers backed up slightly, not in fear, but in that subtle way people move when they realize someone has completely lost it. The neighbor's presence seemed to fuel her instead of temper her. She knew people were watching, but instead of calming down, she got louder, like she was performing. Her arms swung wildly, her feet stomping against the grass as she declared over and over again that nobody would ever put that box in her yard. The workers exchanged glances again, their patience visibly thinning. One of them muttered something, under his breath, not directed at her but clearly meant for the others. Maybe something like, "Here we go again." But still, they didn't shout back. They didn't escalate. They kept their distance, letting her blow up while they tried to figure out what to do next. 5 minutes. That's how long this went on without pause. 5 full minutes of screaming, accusations, and furious energy. The kind of minutes that feel like hours because the tension is so thick you could slice it. By this point, I had moved closer, standing among the growing number of neighbors who had wandered outside. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the scene, whispers darting from one person to another, but nobody stepped in. We all knew this was a storm that had to burn itself out, or be shut down by someone with more authority. But the woman wasn't burning out. If anything, her fury was climbing, pushing higher like a fire that found fresh oxygen. She yelled about lawsuits, about trespassing, about how she would call the HOA herself if she had to. That last part caught my attention because the way she said it carried this air of confidence, as if invoking the HOA was her trump card, the thing that would make these men stop dead in their tracks. The workers didn't even flinch. One of them pointed toward the cones and equipment, calmly repeating that the job was authorized, that the placement was legal, and that nothing she said could change that. And that was when her yelling reached another level. Her voice broke into a scream so shrill it made even the neighbors take a step back. Watching her, I realized this wasn't about a utility box at all. This was about control. She needed to feel like she was in charge, like her words had the power to bend reality. And in that moment, standing there in front of 3 calm, professional workers, she couldn't accept that the world wasn't going to move just because she demanded it. It was tense, uncomfortable, and yet impossible to look away from. The drama unfolding in front of us had turned a quiet afternoon into a spectacle, and even though none of us knew exactly how it would end, one thing was crystal clear: this woman wasn't done yet. The shouting didn't stop, but soon the sound of a truck pulling up cut through the chaos. A white pickup rolled in and parked right near the cones, and out stepped a man in a different uniform. He had that look of someone who wasn't new to situations like this, the calm but serious demeanor of a supervisor who had probably been called to deal with more than a few angry homeowners in his career. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere, like everyone watching was silently wondering if he'd be able to calm her down or if things were about to get even worse. He walked slowly toward her, keeping his hands relaxed at his sides, his voice low and steady as he introduced himself. You could tell he was trying to project authority without aggression, the way someone does when they want to diffuse instead of escalate. The 3 workers looked relieved, stepping back slightly, as if to say, "She's all yours now." The woman, though, wasn't the least bit interested in calming down. The moment her eyes locked on him, her yelling doubled in intensity. She accused him of violating her rights, of destroying her property, of ignoring her as the homeowner. Every word was laced with rage, her arms swinging in wild arcs to emphasize her points. It was almost like she had been waiting for someone higher up to arrive, someone she could really unload on. The supervisor didn't raise his voice. He explained, calmly but firmly, that the equipment was being installed on a utility easement, not her personal yard. He reminded her that easements exist outside of the HOA's control, that no matter what rules or powers she believed she had, the fiber line wasn't up for debate. He even gestured toward the ground, showing her where the lines had been marked, as if visual proof might finally cut through her outrage. But she wasn't hearing any of it. Her face was red, her breathing heavy, and the second he mentioned the easement, she completely lost it. She waved her arms frantically, shouting that this was her land, that she paid taxes, that nobody, not the workers, not the supervisor, not even the HOA could tell her otherwise. Her words tumbled out so fast they were almost incoherent. But the emotion was unmistakable. Absolute defiance. By this point, the neighbors were no longer just peeking through blinds. People were standing outside in clusters, whispering to each other, recording with their phones. Some leaned on fences. Others stood at the edge of their driveways. The quiet little street had turned into a stage, and she was putting on a performance that nobody was going to forget. The supervisor, still maintaining his composure, tried again. He explained that the placement of the fiber box wasn't something he chose. It wasn't a personal decision. It was mapped out by the utility company, approved, and set in stone. He reminded her, once again, that it was legal. But her eyes narrowed, as if every word he said was a direct insult. She wasn't hearing facts, she was hearing challenges. Her voice rose higher, sharper, until it cracked. She shouted that she didn't care about the easement, didn't care about the law, and that she had authority here. Every sentence came out with more force than the last, and you could feel the tension spreading through the crowd. People exchanged glances, muttering about how far she was going to take this. Some shaking their heads like they had seen this kind of behavior from her before, but never this extreme. The workers stood a little behind their supervisor. Their arms crossed, their expressions somewhere between frustration and disbelief. They had done everything right, stayed calm, explained the situation, and still she wouldn't let go. The supervisor, clearly experienced in handling angry homeowners, stayed professional, but you could see the strain starting to show in his posture. The woman, on the other hand, seemed to be gaining energy from her own fury. She stumped closer to him, closing the space between them, her finger jabbing toward his chest as she continued to shout about her supposed rights. The neighbors gasped quietly when she got within inches of him, her body language no longer just angry but aggressive, that it was clear to everyone watching that this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. The supervisor kept his calm exterior, but even he must have realized this woman was beyond reasoning. The way she shouted over him, the way she dismissed every word he said, the way she carried herself with absolute certainty that she was in control, it was like watching a train speed toward a wall. And then, as if on cue, the sound of another engine filled the street. This time, it wasn't another work truck, it was a police cruiser. The flashing lights bounced across the houses as it slowed to a stop, and a new wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. The neighbors had seen arguments before, maybe even fights, but this was different. This was about to turn official. The supervisor glanced toward the cruiser with a look of relief, but the woman didn't seem concerned at all. If anything, she puffed up even more, as though the arrival of the police was just another chance for her to prove she was right. Her shouting didn't stop. Her arms kept flailing, and the crowd grew even quieter, waiting to see what would happen. When authority met unshakable defiance, the police officer stepped out of the cruiser, adjusting his belt and scanning the scene. You could tell from his posture that he'd probably walked into plenty of domestic disputes and loud arguments before. But even he seemed to notice the intensity of what he was stepping into. The woman's voice cut across the air before he could even open his mouth, as though she were trying to get ahead of whatever authority he might bring into the conversation. She turned sharply, pointed toward the workers, then toward the supervisor, her words pouring out so fast that they tripped over each other. She yelled about trespassing, about illegal work, about her rights as a homeowner. The officer held up a hand in that universal sign for calm down, but it didn't make the slightest difference. She wasn't slowing down. If anything, his presence only seemed to energize her further. Then, with a sudden burst of pride, she dropped the line that stunned everyone standing within earshot. "I'm the president of this HOA," she shouted, her chest puffing out as though she had just played her strongest card. "That means I'm in charge, easement or not." The neighbors, already whispering among themselves, reacted instantly. You could hear the murmurs ripple through the crowd, little exclamations of surprise, disbelief, and even laughter. Some shook their heads in shock, others raised their eyebrows, and that, of course, it's her kind of way. For some, this revelation explained everything. The controlling attitude, the need to assert power, the refusal to accept fact, all suddenly made sense. The officer's face remained neutral, though you could almost see the gears turning in his head. He'd heard a lot of excuses in his career, but this one was unusual. Being president of a homeowners association didn't make her the ruler of the land. It didn't put her above the law, and it certainly didn't give her the right to stop a utility installation authorized by the city. The supervisor, standing just a few feet away, kept his hands at his sides, but you could see the weariness in his eyes. He'd been patient, more patient than most people would have been. But the claim that she was somehow in charge of easements was so outrageous that even his calm facade seemed close to cracking. Still, he didn't argue. He let the officer take the lead, but she wasn't done. Her voice rose again, more defiant than ever. She jabbed her finger toward the ground, repeating over and over that this was her yard, that the HOA rules gave her the final say, that the workers had no right to be there. She declared loudly that if the officer didn't remove them immediately, she would handle it herself. Every word was sharper, every gesture more aggressive, her body practically shaking with the force of her rage. The neighbors were captivated. Nobody was going back inside. Now, phones were held higher, angles adjusted to capture every second of this unraveling. To them, this wasn't just an angry neighbor anymore, was the president of their HOA, unraveling in public, throwing around her title like it was a badge of invincibility. And the more she yelled, the clearer it became that her title meant nothing in the face of reality. The officer finally spoke, his tone calm but firm. He explained that the workers were within their rights, that the installation was legal, and that her position in the HOA had nothing to do with utility easements. His words were simple, direct, and final. But once again, she refused to accept it. She shook her head violently, her hair flying, her voice nearly breaking, as she shouted back at him that it was no longer about the box, no longer about the yard. It was about pride, control, and an unwillingness to back down, even when the truth was staring her in the face. She had backed herself into a corner, and instead of stepping out, she was digging in deeper, determined to prove she could win a fight that had already been lost. The tension reached a boiling point. Her shouts echoed off the houses. The officer stood ready, the supervisor still silent but clearly bracing himself. And the workers shifted nervously behind the cones. The crowd was dead quiet now, waiting, sensing that something was about to break, and then it happened. With one last furious outburst, she closed the distance between herself and the supervisor, her face inches from his. She screamed something incoherent, her words drowned by the sheer volume of her rage. And before anyone could react, her hand shot up and struck him across the face. Gasps erupted from the neighbors. Phones jolted as people tried to capture the moment. The supervisor's head jerked slightly from the impact, but his expression stayed shockingly composed, like a man too stunned to even react. The officer, though, wasted no time. His patience evaporated in an instant, and a blur of motion, he grabbed her arms, spun her around, and forced her to the ground. The woman shrieked, her voice no longer commanding, but panicked, her arms flailing as the officer cuffed her hands behind her back. The entire neighborhood watched wide-eyed, as the self-proclaimed ruler of the community was reduced to a screaming figure face down in the grass. The moment the officer cuffed her, the street erupted not with cheers or clapping, but with a collective wave of murmurs, whispers, and gasps that rolled through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. People couldn't believe what they had just seen. Just minutes ago, this woman had been screaming about her power, about her authority as HOA president, and now she was lying face down in the grass, her wrists locked tightly behind her back. The supervisor stepped back, brushing the side of his cheek where she had struck him. His expression was a strange mix of disbelief and exhaustion. You could tell he wasn't hurt badly, but the sheer absurdity of the situation had left its mark. One of the workers muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he picked up a tool from the ground. The other two exchanged glances that seemed to say, "Did that really just happen?" The officer pulled the woman up onto her feet. She was still shouting, though her tone had shifted. Gone was the fiery confidence, the righteous rage of someone who believed she was untouchable. Now her words cracked with desperation. She yelled about injustice, about how she was being wrongfully arrested, about how this would all be taken up with her lawyers. She insisted the HOA would have the final word, that this arrest was a mistake, that she would be back. But the officer wasn't entertaining her rant. He guided her firmly toward the cruiser, his hand steady on her arm as she resisted every step of the way. Neighbors had their phones out, filming every second, some whispering that the videos would be online before the hour was up. A few shook their heads, embarrassed for her. Others smirked, maybe even enjoying the downfall of someone who had likely made their lives difficult in the past. The supervisor didn't move until the cruiser door slammed shut behind her. Only then did he take a slow breath and glance toward the watching neighbors. He gave a small shrug, the kind of gesture that said, "Well, that escalated fast." Then, almost as if nothing had happened, he turned back toward his workers and told them to continue the installation. Business as usual, even with the chaos that had just unfolded. And the workers did exactly that. They picked up their tools, adjusted their safety vests, and got back to work beside the orange cones and marked lines. The sound of drills and equipment soon filled the air again, an oddly normal soundtrack, against the backdrop of flashing police lights and neighbors still buzzing about the spectacle. The neighbors, though, weren't going anywhere. Clusters of people stood in driveways and on lawns, gossiping, dissecting every moment of what they'd witnessed. Some replayed videos on their phones, showing the slap in slow motion. Others speculated about what charges she might face. Words like assault and resisting arrest floated through the crowd. A few shook their heads, saying it was only a matter of time before she crossed a line like this. For many, the most shocking part wasn't that she had lost her temper. It was the realization that their HOA president, The person who had spent years enforcing rules and barking orders about paint colors, lawn heights, and trash bins, had revealed herself in front of everyone as completely unhinged. The authority she had clung to for so long, the respect she had demanded, was gone in an instant. As the cruiser finally pulled away, her voice still faintly audible through the closed windows, the neighborhood seemed to exhale all at once. The chaos was over, but the memory of it would linger. People laughed nervously, others shook their heads, and more than a few declared that this was the craziest thing they had ever seen on their street. The officer would file his report, the supervisor would move on to the next job site, and the workers would finish the installation. But for the neighbors, this moment would live on for years. The HOA president who claimed ultimate authority, who tried to stop progress in the name of control, had been humbled in the most public way possible. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. Within hours, clips of the incident circulated online, posted to local Facebook groups, and shared in neighborhood chats. People who had never met her were suddenly talking about the infamous HOA president who slapped a supervisor and wound up in handcuffs. Her reputation wasn't just tarnished, it was demolished. And the lesson hung heavy in the air. Authority doesn't give you the right to trample over others. Power, especially when misused, has consequences. The HOA president had believed she was above the law, but the law had proven otherwise. The easement didn't care about her title. The officer didn't care about her shouting, and the neighborhood would never see her the same way again. For the man repairing the porch, for the neighbors who watched, for the workers who endured the screaming, it was a story that would be retold countless times, not just as neighborhood drama, but as a cautionary tale about control, pride, and what happens when you let anger rule your actions. Because in the end, no matter how loudly she screamed, no matter how hard she fought, no matter what title she clung to, the easement remained. The fiber line was installed, and the HOA president left her own street not in triumph, but in the back of a police car.